Thank you so much for coming along. Great to see so many people out on Wednesday night. I'll just run through quickly. You probably know this building better than me. I assume if there's some sort of emergency, we follow signs and go out into an open area. I think the toilets are out the back. I'm pretty sure there's some out there. I want to start acknowledging that we are on Ngunnawal country. Ngunnawal people have lived and looked after this land for hundreds and hundreds of generations, which kind of boggles my mind when you try and think in that sort of time frame. And so I want to acknowledge elders past and present. I'm going to make a few opening remarks and then hand over to the panel. Everyone's going to speak about their area of expertise. And then we've got some policy pitches from people. And so you can scan the QR code and upload them. And then we're going to invite people up to the lectern for a minute policy pitch. And then go into a bit of a Q&A, potentially discuss some of the things that were put forward, but really just try and answer some of the questions that come from you. So let's get into it. As we often hear so much about, well, young people being disengaged from politics, checking out, and when I look at the decision making in Parliament, I'm new there. I've been in the Senate for 3 years. Probably not hard to see why. We're not exactly dealing with the big challenges that younger generations are going to have to face. There's lots of tinkering. No one seems to be willing to go after the root causes of the big challenges. Housing, climate, better access to mental health, HECS, all the things that we know are issues for young people. The thing I urge young people to do is, rather than getting cynical and checking out, is to actually get involved. And so I'm sure you all know people who have checked out, but thanks so much for turning up. We do have a great democracy in this country, and we're now at a spot where young people, for the first time, are the biggest voting bloc in Australia. And so I think there's real opportunity to start to change things. I want to go through some of the things that this Parliament has been working on. As I said, I think there's been a real lack of ambition. And that's one of the things I hear from young people, is that there is energy, there is a willingness to take on the big challenges and to really urge politicians to actually make some changes. I've seen when there's political will in that place, things can change so quickly. And I think that is the thing we need, is more people in there who are actually willing to put all of us ahead of either self-interest as a party or vested interests, who are making donations and then also threatening, saying if you don't actually do what we want, then we're going to run campaigns against you in the media. And many of you would have seen them in the past. So if we start with students and students on campus, Phoebe will talk more about safety on campus, but I just wanted to give an example of how things can actually change in politics. In July 2023, Camille from the Stop campaign approached my office to talk about the advocacy that they, Fair Agenda and End Rape on Campus have been doing for years around sexual assaults on campus. I knew it was an issue, but I was actually really shocked when my team briefed me on just how bad it was. A few weeks later, I invited a group of 6 young advocates up to Parliament House to push the issue with parliamentarians. And come on in. There's some seats up the front if you want. Straight to the back. We stood up at a press conference, a bunch of independents, who obviously hearing from young people that this is an issue, had a press conference. An hour later, we got that group a meeting with the Education Minister. 6 months after that, in February this year, federal and state education ministers agreed to set up a national student ombudsman. And then in November, we've actually passed legislation through the House and the Senate to make that happen. Clearly, there's a lot more to be done, but I think you can see what happens when you do actually have young people advocating and you have politicians in there who are willing to listen and actually push the issue with the relevant minister, make the case, cause a bit of a ruckus in Parliament at times. Student debt is another one that you all know better than most, is a huge challenge, and we're going to hear from Professor Bruce Chapman a bit later. He's actually in hospital that has insisted on zooming in, so we're going to get a zoom in from Canberra Hospital, I assume. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see in a bit. The government's made some welcome changes. They've obviously changed the rate of indexation, but the timing of indexation still means that you're effectively being charged indexation or interest on 11 months of repayments, which I just don't understand. Like, no one else would hack that. If you had a mortgage or a credit card and the bank was saying, yeah, pay us for 11 months and we'll keep charging you interest, there'd be riots. When it comes to young people, we've been doing that for far too long now. And so that's, I think, a really sensible thing that we should do, change the date of indexation. I've actually got the Parliamentary Budget Office to cost what that would mean. And over the next 4 years, it would save students $700 million in Australia to basically just charge them indexation interest on what they should be charged on. So I don't understand why that hasn't been changed yet, but it's certainly something that I'll continue to push with Labor, or whoever forms the next government. Labor's promised to wipe 20% of existing student debt if they win the election, which I'm sure is very welcome, but it really doesn't. Again, it doesn't address the root cause, which is job-ready graduates, which mean that some students have a HECS debt that's 100% higher than if you'd done the degree 5-10 years ago. It makes no sense. It's totally failed. The Universities Accord said it should be changed. I think, again, we had that recommendation a year ago. There's been no change. Pay prac is another one. Great to see it introduced. I think it needs to be expanded to other professions. We also need to see the rate go up. $320 a week if you're having to live away from home for a prac. That's not going to go far unless you've got some serious support from elsewhere. That brings me to Oz Study and Youth Allowance, which May is going to talk more about. We have a social security system, safety net in Australia, which really isn't keeping people out of poverty. I think as a wealthy country, that's something that we should all be doing. There's plenty of ways we could be raising revenue from the gas that we seem pretty happy to give away for free to multinationals. That could be far better spent here in Australia. Housing, I had a whole event last night, so I'm not going to go over everything, but in summary, we need the government to invest in building way more social and affordable homes. Just focusing on first home buyers isn't enough. That's what we've seen the major parties focus on. We need sensible reform to capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. Again, something the major parties don't want to touch. And above all else, I think we actually need a plan. We don't have a national housing and homelessness plan. It seems pretty crazy to me. I've got a bill that would legislate a 10-year plan, and we'll keep pushing that again. Climate, obviously, something that affects us all now, but it's going to affect you all more. I've been pushing for a duty of care on climate. It seems pretty common sense to me. Hannah's going to talk a little bit more about that. A lot of support from basically everyone except the major parties on it, and maybe the coal and gas industry. Youth mental health is one of the biggest concerns I hear from young people. Accessibility, it's incredibly hard to get in to see anyone, and if you can, it's so expensive. And I think at a time where we're facing so many challenges, being able to actually reach out and get the support you need early to avert far bigger challenges down the track is really common sense. It's something that we should be doing a lot more on. Labor and the Coalition both pledged to increase funding this campaign, but I don't think it goes far enough. Again, like we're sort of seeing tinkering when everyone knows that the system isn't working. So I don't want to talk too much because we've got some genuine experts in these different areas. So I'm going to hand over to Hannah now. And Hannah's also running as my running mate for the Senate. So please welcome Hannah Vardy.
Thanks, Dave, for that introduction. I'm Hannah Vardy, and it's a real privilege to be running alongside David for the Senate at this election. I'm also a proud Canberra local and a fourth year student here at ANU, studying climate science, molecular biology and law. I don't think I ever imagined I'd be running for Parliament at 21, and it's certainly been a bit surreal to be a part of it all over the last few weeks. We know that we need much greater courage to tackle some of the big issues that we face. And it's been such a privilege to advocate for some of the policy solutions that young people are calling for during this campaign. Politics should be about people. Decisions made by political leaders have real impacts on millions of people, and those decisions are more consequential for our future than those made on climate change. Having experienced the bushfires here in Canberra over the Black Summer as an asthmatic, having family who lost childhood homes in floods have ravaged part of northern New South Wales, it astounded me that for so long governments weren't taking the action this crisis demands. And so, for the past 2 years, I've been lucky enough to work alongside Anjali, Jess and Daisy, as well as David's office, on a campaign to legislate a duty of care to protect young Australians from climate harm. Imagine if our leaders had a legal obligation to think about the impacts of climate change on young Australians. To me and so many others, this is just common sense. We know that a warming world will make it more difficult for our generation to live out our aspirations, to enjoy this beautiful country as generations before us have. And this is not our fault. For the first time under Australian law, a duty of care bill, like the one that David has introduced, would acknowledge this fact, that our generation and those to come will be the ones to face the worst of the escalating impacts of climate change. The duty of care proposal is supported by over 25,000 Australians, young and old, as well as sporting stars like Pat Cummins, Australia's most decorated Olympian Emma McKeon, former Socceroos captain Craig Foster, alongside former political leaders, artists, authors, firefighters, doctors, and so many more. The Senate also held an inquiry into the bill, which, as David mentioned, received over 400 submissions from all across the country. Only one of these 403 submissions was against the bill, and there's no prizes here for guessing where that might have come from. It was from a think tank funded by Gina Reinhardt. Truly shocking, we know. To me, what is so powerful about this bill, and the community independent movement more broadly, is its ability to bring together people from all sectors of society and elevate the issues that matter to their community. We'll keep pushing for this duty to be passed in the next term of Parliament, so that governments are accountable for their part in worsening the climate crisis. We know that our generation is inheriting a future defined by growing intergenerational inequity. We are facing the climate and biodiversity crises, widening gaps in housing affordability, ever-increasing university debt, and an increasingly volatile geopolitical world. We are the ones with the most to gain and the most to lose from the decisions made by the Parliament that we elect in less than 2 weeks. But too often we aren't at the table when these decisions are being made. At present, more than half of Australians are aged under 40, yet people under 40 make up only 8% of our Parliament. This is not representative democracy, and it really shows. It is no wonder then that so many of the decisions made in Parliament do not reflect our long-term interests. But this election presents an exciting opportunity to change this. Gen Z and millennials comprise the biggest voting bloc for the first time in our history. We have the numbers and we also have the momentum. So, as you cast your ballot in the coming weeks, remember that the climate crisis will not wait, and nor should we. We shouldn't wait to get engaged, to get informed, and to get involved. We are so fortunate to live in one of the healthiest democracies in the world. So if you have questions about this election, find out. If an ACT voter, ask me, ask David, ask someone you know. And have conversations in your networks and in your families about these issues as well. Because the way you vote, no matter what electorate you're enrolled to vote in, matters deeply in shaping the future we're going to inherit. Thanks so much.
Hello, and this is Bruce Chapman. Thank you so much for inviting me and allowing me to be part of this important conversation. I feel privileged to be involved. I wanted to start with a very broad statement. Can you confirm, David, that you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Bruce.
Great, thank you very much. The broad statement is that when it comes to student tuition, I think basically the HECS is the right system. I think in concept it's fair. And remember what it's all about. Students don't have to pay anything upon enrolment to go to university. No student has to fund any money up front, and they only pay when and if they can in the future. And if you compare that to other loan systems around the world, I think you'd find HECS really does protect people from adverse consequences. Most student loan systems require people to pay even when they have no money, and that's not true with HECS. If you're in trouble, you're insured against that. So in concept, while it's fine, I don't think in detail at the moment it is fine. And it's been a very big 5 years, the last 5 years, with respect to HECS and changes to HECS. And I want to talk about a couple of those. Several of them have already been brought up by David in Parliament and in other ways. And I wanted to start by saying, let's not be too miserable. Some good things have happened. One of the good things that happened as a consequence of the University Accord process was that the very first threshold of repayment, that is when people have to begin to repay their debt, has gone up very significantly to $67,000 a year from about $52,000, and people only paying 1%. That's where it was at the beginning. But governments all over 35 years have changed it radically and it became less and less fair. So one good thing is that first threshold of repayment is now where it should be at about average earnings. So that's a plus. I also think that the indexation changes to be the lesser of wages and prices is also a positive thing. And I'll say some more about indexation in a little while. But there are several really critical and important problems. And the first is that the prices are all wrong. And this started in 2020 with the former government, where the prices were changed radically. And David referred to some of those. The prices of humanities more than doubled. And the prices in some of the areas where people do very well in the labour market, like medical specialty, are now lower than what it would cost to study humanities. And yet humanities female students are the lowest income graduates over their lifetime. This is very unfair, and it's not going to stop people coming because people really want to go. But there's no sense of justice in this, and I think that this is something that the government is very well aware of. But let's ask the question, isn't it about time, and I think it has been time, for serious attention being given to the change? I think it will happen. I think it would be preferable that it happens extremely quickly. The other area where I think that things are in disarray is postgraduate pricing. Universities are allowed for about 50% of their postgraduate students to charge whatever they like. And that's a very bad idea in my view, because they've got extraordinary market power and they will charge whatever they like if they've got that kind of market power. And some of the prices for postgraduate, which will just be added to the HECS debt, and makes those HECS debts sometimes to be extremely high, they can be as high as 80 to 100,000. Not many people are in that situation, but having price discretion with essentially a public sector institution like universities is not good economics, and it's led to the very high debts, and the very high debts, of course, have been compounded by the very large charges unfairly for areas such as humanities. With that said, the other point I'd make about indexation, before saying something a bit positive about indexation, is that David is completely correct. At the moment, the government adjusts, and that is indexes, increases the amount. It's a pseudo interest rate on debts that aren't in existence for some people. So the beginning could have been 6 or 12 months ago, and yet the indexation is added to the current HECS debt. That is a very poor way to run the system and could lead to an undermining of it. Those two things, those things in particular, that one and the prices can be changed. I think the government is well aware of that, but I do think that David's encouragement of this being addressed is an extremely important part of public policy. I do think indexation can be justified. I'll explain that in Q&A if it comes up. Thank you so much again for the opportunity to share some thoughts and some disquiet thoughts about the HECS system as it currently is. Thank you.
You know what, actually, I think you guys can hear me pretty well. Is that, yeah, okay, wonderful. My name is Phoebe Denham, and I've long been an activist and a student leader here at ANU. My work is often focused on campaigning for better prevention and response systems to stop sexual violence on our campus. Now, while that's the area where I've done most of my work, it would be remiss of me not to talk about some of the other aspects of student safety that are at the front of my mind at the moment. Transphobia, for example, is rife on university campuses across Australia, as is Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, racism, ableism. I could go on and on. Thank you. We've recently even seen universities abusing technology to surveil and discipline their own students and suppress student activism. Universities have even, across the country, used police to suppress genuine and peaceful protests, including Palestine protests, directly undermining student safety. So absolutely, without a doubt, student safety is a massive issue right now. Now, before I go on, I do acknowledge that these topics might be confronting for people, upsetting and frustrating, and so I really encourage everybody to look after yourselves. Whether you need to step out or zone out for a minute, please do whatever works for you. And of course, please respect the boundaries and privacy of everybody around you. I also would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who have been the custodians of the land in this region for thousands of years. It truly is a very beautiful area that we live in, and I believe it's really important for us to keep the impacts of colonisation at the forefront of our minds when having these types of discussions, not least because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students are far more likely to have experienced sexual violence in their time at university than other students. So with that in mind, I'm going to start by taking us through a bit of the history of sexual violence campaigns and policies at universities. There have been protests and campaigns since at least the 1980s, and I'm sure well before then. But it was really with the 2017 Australian Human Rights Commission Change the Course report that the scale of the issue came to light, and universities, I think, were really forced to reckon with it for the first time. And since then, there have been a variety of responses from universities, and there's also, the issue has become a focus for groups like the regulator TEXA and groups like Universities Australia. Universities Australia also has commissioned 2 national student safety surveys that have gathered data from tens of thousands of students across the nation to really get a better picture of the exact situation. And as I'm sure a lot of you know or could expect, the situation is dire, right? There is no question that sexual assault and sexual harassment are a common occurrence for university students. More recently, as the Senator mentioned, we have seen the introduction of the National Student Ombudsman, and we're moments really away from having a national code to prevent and respond to gender-based violence in higher education. And these are unequivocally positive steps from the government. But it is worth noting, again, as the Senator explained earlier, that these changes, in a huge part, came about because of the tireless efforts of students, right? Through student unions, including the National Union of Students, and also through independent organisations such as the Stop Campaign and Rape on Campus and Fair Agenda. Now, there is another National Student Safety Survey coming up, and I think this one will really create the benchmark from which we can assess the efficacy of the new Ombudsman, the code, and all the new policies that we're going to see come out of universities in the next 5, 10 years and beyond. But the work from the government is certainly not over, right? For me, there are 3 key things that I believe we really need to see over the next couple of years from the government. First of all, continuing to hear students' voices and allow them and their experiences to shape policy and legislation. This means using the surveys, for example, to tweak policy, but also ongoing communication with student groups and independent organisations, and really giving platforms to students who have been directly affected by these issues. It also means prioritising what students say and ask for over the often, reluctant and arguably slow bureaucratic machines that are universities. Related to this, it's also vital, I believe, that the systems and policies that emerge over the next few years reflect the diversity of experiences of students. It is abundantly clear already that marginalised groups experience higher rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment in their time at university than other students. The 2021 National Student Safety Survey revealed that 29% of disabled students had been sexually harassed during their studies at university. That's compared with 13.5% of other students. It also revealed that 7.8% of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students had been sexually assaulted in their time at university, compared with 4.5% of other students. So these are just 2 examples from the surveys, but it's very clear to me that we're not going to make any strides forward in terms of student safety without maintaining a distinctive intersectional approach. Finally, and more broadly, this all has to be part of the government appreciating the importance of higher education to our society and not treating universities like degree factories. Universities shape our societies, right? Not only through research and academic outcomes, but also through the types of people they create. Every time a student's education is interrupted or paused or ceased even by sexual assault or harassment, our society loses. And in every way that sexual violence is inadequately responded to, there are flow-on effects to the culture of our broader society. We need to see an ongoing understanding and reflection of these effects in the government's work and in policies relating to sexual violence and discrimination on university campuses. So that's what I'm personally looking for in this upcoming election. I think as young people, we often need to fight against systems that have existed for longer than we've been alive, but committing to that and not backing down is exactly how we're going to make our community safer for everyone. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I also too want to start and just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, and I also want to acknowledge our unique ancestry that's in the room today. I think that's really special. Look, I usually introduce myself with my academic credentials, my thesis, where I work and all these things that I do, but I actually think that you get a better understanding of who I am when you understand someone's why. And like we were just saying, content warning, and just do what you need to do to get through kind of this conversation. My name is Jed Moriarty. I am a 25-year-old, and I grew up in this rural town in rural Queensland. And about 5 years ago, I tried to take my own life. And the reason I tell this story is because my why, and the reason I work with masculinity and mental health, is because I just want men and boys to feel supported so that they don't go through the same hardships that I had to go through before they're seeking help. I'm really privileged to work for this organisation called The Man Cave. Anyway, if you haven't heard of us, we're a preventative mental health charity based in Brunswick in Melbourne. And we just strive to empower teenage boys to be the best versions of themselves. In the last 10 years of our work, we have worked with over 80,000 teenage boys. And when I think about what I needed growing up, I know that like workshops that the Man Cave provides or something similar, it would have nudged me in more of a healthier direction. I want to name today that I'm also speaking on behalf of men and boys, but I can completely acknowledge that women and girls' heightened experiences of psychological distress can coexist. But my expertise in my field is men and boys, and today's intentionally focusing on masculinity and its intersection with mental health. I read this article last week, and it was talking about how Gen Z men, in particular, are leaning more towards traditional and often harmful ideas of what it means to be a man. Gen Z men are more likely to agree that men make better political leaders than women. They're also likely to agree that women don't deserve to earn as much as men. And I'm not here to depict why they exist, but I think it's really important to understand why these attitudes, or how these attitudes correlate to an individual's well-being. In 2024, the Man Box, which is a study done on Australian men, found that it kind of asked men to agree or disagree with a set of rules of how to be a man. It included hypersexuality, emotional suppression, and even using violence to get respect if necessary. And what the Man Box found was that men who agree with these set of rules are 7 times more likely to think about suicide, they're 6 times more likely to self-harm, and they're 3 times more likely to experience little to no pleasure in their day-to-day life. And it's really confronting to hear that my generation, and particularly, or maybe even our generation, is really struggling with their place in a world so much differently to everyone else around them. And I also think it's really easy to push statistics like that away and kind of blame, let's say, the rural Queensland men where I grew up. I can say that I grew up out there, but it's kind of easy to push statistics away and blame it on other people. But recently the Man Cave did a study last month with 1,000 teenage boys, and 50% of them told us that a gay man is not a real man. It's pretty confronting to think about, but it's also important to recognise that there are 50% of those boys that do think otherwise. And that's what the Man Cave is really seeing in our workshops, but it's also what we're trying to empower. Because what we do is we create spaces for boys to be a little bit messy, and we challenge where these thoughts come from. And what we see is that teenage boys are really passionate about changing this narrative, but it is our collective responsibility as the unintended role models in their lives to guide them the way, because they can't really do it on their own. At the Man Cave, we also provide healthy and diverse role models, and the reason we do this is because we see in our statistics that boys who have these role models in their lives, these positive role models, they have better health outcomes for themselves, but they're also more capable of creating safer and more respectful environments for the people around them. At the end of the day, boys can't be what they can't see. And we even asked the teenage boys what a positive male role model was, and they knuckled it down to this word called range. Boys want physical presence in their life, but they also want emotional presence. Boys want to be pushed to be the best version that they can be, but they also want us to be there to catch them when they fall. Boys are, they're looking for kind of this emotional courage, and they're also wanting to be celebrated for it, for when they do it. Because I feel like when boys are provided that type of masculinity, they're not only provided with an example of change, but they're also given the permission to change themselves. My last point here is that there's a generation of boys, particularly teenage boys, that are itching to change what it means, or the narrative around what it means to be a man in Australia, because they want it to be something that they can celebrate. And so what we're seeing is that when we can get in early, we can really see boys, the beauty of what it means to be a teenage boy, but also the ripple effects that it has in their communities. I just want to finish by thanking Senator Pocock and your team for having me today, and I'm really excited to have the discussion later. Thanks.
I'm a final year medical student at the ANU, and I'm also the ANU rep for the Australian Medical Students Association. So I'm here to talk about paid placements, but before I do, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. So the recent announcement that teaching, nursing and social work students will receive paid placement support is a huge and very, very welcome step. These students give so much to our communities during their training, and it's only right that they're recognised and supported. but there's a glaring omission: medical students. Medical students have to take on placements which are often inflexible and have really high contact hours. Over 2,000 hours at many universities, and these are mostly unpaid. This involves 2 years minimum in clinical placements, requiring full-time hours with additional study and lectures, which often have quite volatile scheduling, with little to no notice about when classes will be. So where does this leave time for part-time work? It's extremely inaccessible, and this has been noted across the board from medical students all across Australia. Sorry, I just lost where I was. Medical placements aren't just demanding, they can be financially devastating. Often this is exacerbated by the mounting costs that students face, as they most often have had to relocate from their home to pursue their dreams of medical school. This is also exacerbated by the fact that we move constantly, often to rural and remote areas with little to no notice and no guarantee of housing or income. One medical student had to defer their first year of university and worked 4 jobs to secure savings to prepare for years of unpaid placements. As a medical student, she balances 38 hours of mandatory placements with 2 jobs. This is just one of many stories. So yes, we celebrate that teaching, nursing, and social work students are being recognised. But if we're serious about equity in education and about building a sustainable, diverse healthcare workforce, then medical students must be part of this conversation too. All students suffer from placement poverty and barriers regarding the accessibility of medical degrees, but we must support the medical students who are hit hardest by the cost of living. They'll become the doctors that we need most. So this includes First Nations students who face the highest barriers yet have the lowest attrition rates, students from rural areas who are most likely to go back and serve those same communities, postgrad students or those students who have families who aren't able to access Centrelink and youth allowance, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds who are already stretched thin and then faced with years of medical education where they can't work. These are the students that will go on to become the doctors who serve everywhere, in big cities, small towns, in hospitals and clinics where the workforce is already stretched beyond capacity. Medical students play a critical role in our health system. We assist across every area of the hospital, reducing pressure on junior doctors by taking histories, putting in cannulas, taking bloods, and the list goes on. We contribute clinically and administratively. We're being trained on the job. The placement serves as the most rich teaching experience that shapes who we are as clinicians. Skipping these crucial teaching opportunities is just not an option. The more we're involved locally during our training, the more likely we are to stay and strengthen those health systems after graduation, especially in regional and rural areas. By 2031, an additional 1,000 CSP positions are stated to be added to medical schools. But this isn't the only solution to addressing the issues we have with our health workforce. We need to protect medical students so that they have the resources to continue and finish their degrees so that we can continue to strengthen that workforce. So how feasible is it to support us financially? New Zealand has already done it, and we've seen it be done for teaching, social work, and nursing students as well. A means-tested stipend for final year and high-need students is not only achievable, it's a smart policy, and we would like to see it for medical students. It ensures that support goes to those who need it and gives our health system a sustainable, well-prepared workforce in return. The key students to start with are final year students and First Nations students, as they contribute the most on placements, and First Nations students, as I mentioned before, have the lowest attrition rates. And let's be clear, the argument that you'll earn well later does not hold up. Future income does not pay for this week's groceries or rent. It doesn't cover for the cost of relocation. And it certainly doesn't make up for the students we're losing right now because they simply cannot afford to stay in this degree. Because when they drop out, we lose something much bigger, a future doctor who understands their community, who wants to serve their rural areas and their communities and bring diverse perspectives to this field. Medical students aren't asking for special treatment, we're asking for fair support, just like our colleagues in teaching, nursing and social work. Because if we want a health system that's strong, fair and built for the future, then we need to invest in all of the students who will one day staff it. Thank you.
that. Hi everyone, my name is May Azizi. I'm the Deputy CEO of Anglicare Australia, and I'm the national spokesperson for a campaign called Everybody's Home to fix Australia's housing crisis. I want to start by echoing everybody's really beautiful acknowledgements of country tonight, acknowledging that we're here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I think it's really important when we talk about housing and social security, which is what I'm here to talk about tonight, to acknowledge that we're talking about how to house and organise ourselves on land that's stolen. So I'm going to talk first about housing, and then I'll veer into social security and payments. I'll start by talking a bit about our campaign, Everybody's Home, a campaign to fix Australia's housing crisis. We were launched in 2018 before that federal election to put housing issues on the agenda, and housing issues have been on the agenda, I think actually because of the public demand for action over the past couple of years, and it's something politicians can't get away from, but unfortunately are not really addressing in a very serious way, as David was saying when he introduced it. I'm going to talk a little bit about where this crisis comes from and then how to fix it. So there was actually a time in Australian history when housing was very affordable. Housing was affordable to rent and to buy. After the Second World War, governments in Australia built up public housing from the ground up. We were building about 30,000 homes a year, and about 1 in 4 new builds at the high point was actually being built by the government. Right up until the early 80s in Australia, 1 in 3 renters was renting from the government. That was all kinds of people, public servants, teachers, construction workers, you name it. It's a really big part of why housing was affordable. And over the past 4 decades, we've seen a really big change in how the government approaches housing. We've seen a move away from directly supplying housing. This was like the common sense way to make housing affordable back in the day. Oh, we've got a problem with housing, we're going to build some homes, directly supply them to people. In the past couple of decades, the approach has been to kind of support people to be in private tenancies through things like Commonwealth rent assistance, but also supporting investors to invest in housing. So actually, Australia spends much more now on housing than we used to back when housing was affordable, but we don't spend it providing homes to people. We spend it on tax breaks for investors to invest in housing. That's really pushed up the cost of homes. It's made it expensive to buy, and it's also made it very expensive to rent. I think that's something that's really underappreciated because so many people who are landlords in Australia today are very highly leveraged, like amateur landlords, and that's made the cost of renting a lot more expensive than it was back when people were what we say positively geared. I'll try not to use too much jargon. So our campaign calls for a big boost to social housing. We've got a shortfall of 640,000 social homes. When I say social housing, that means housing that's provided by the government or by community organisations, and it's just low-cost rentals that people can afford. I think it can be a confusing sort of phrase. We've got a shortfall of 640,000 now, and that's going to grow to 940,000, so nearly a million over the next 20 years, and we're doing almost nothing, almost nothing about it. So we need to see some action, or a whole lot of people are going to be in very, very, very severe rental stress. And I've been shocked that this has not factored into the election campaign at all. We've got 1 in 3 Australians who rent, and there is nothing on the table for them at this election, which is kind of shocking, but not surprising based on everything we've seen. I'll talk a little bit as well about the social security payments that David spoke about, because the renters who are on the very lowest incomes and who are doing it the toughest are people who are on job seeker, but especially youth allowance. Youth allowance is the lowest payment, the lowest Centrelink payment that you can get in Australia. Anglicare Australia puts out something called the Rental Affordability Snapshot every year, and our next one is actually coming out next Wednesday. We don't release the figures super publicly, but I will tell you, every year since I started working at Anglicare back in 2017, it's been 0 houses out of tens of thousands of rental listings across the country. I don't just mean 0%, I mean 0 houses or share houses affordable for a person on youth allowance. So that's 30% of your income. And can't release the numbers early, but it's been 0 for many years, and I think you can infer what you want about what it might be next Wednesday. So we need to see a big boost to these payments. Anglicare is actually also going to come out later this year, and I'll be in touch with David's office about this, to actually say that we need to abolish youth allowance. Young people, it's not cheaper to be a young person in Australia. You're competing for the same share houses as people who are on job seeker. If you're living in student housing, I know many of you know that's actually a lot more expensive than share housing. There is no reason to be on payments that are so much lower than the job seeker payment, which itself is hundreds of dollars below the poverty line. I'm hoping we'll have some time in the Q&A to get into a bit more of all of this, because I can nerd out on more of the numbers, but I also just wanted to finish by saying thank you so much to David and your office for inviting me to be a part of this, but also for the leadership that you've shown on both of these issues, on housing and on social security. One of the reasons why we haven't seen the action that we need to see on fixing the housing crisis in Australia, because it's actually quite simple. We just need the government to step in and make it an essential service like health or education, is because they don't want to pay for it and they don't want to be responsible for it. And I think we're seeing that manifest in the approach to David and your bill to enshrine a housing and homelessness plan and make housing a human right. So thanks, I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you all. We're going to now give people a minute to pitch their policy solution. I think we've got some music. If you hit 60 seconds, we'll start playing some music so we can get some questions in a bit. If Heidi, are you here? No? Okay. Elaine? Yeah. Coming up.
Thank you. In 2024, 56% of young Australians stated that housing affordability is of a top concern. I'm 15 and all my friends and I have to worry about housing right now. The only way to relieve the stress is by implementing tax reforms. According to the Australian Council of Social Service, current tax policies allow wealthier people to pay less tax when taking out a loan to buy a house, which then they rent out. Implementing concessional tax treatment will create equity and robustness of the comprehensive income tax system. Some options for the CGT discount is to reduce the CGT discount for housing investments while keeping it at 50% for shares. In reducing this, speculative investment in housing will most likely shift to the share market. For negative gearing, the best thing we can currently do for this is scaling the deductions made on personal passive investments. Scaling the deduction based on income level means higher earners get less deductions. The reform options will also need to consider the speed and timing of the transition, while dealing with previous and future investments. Thank you.
No, we'll skip anonymous. Nick Barker?
Very short, you'll have to forgive me. Okay, so youth homelessness affects over 40,000 young people across Australia every year. I did math, which is a lot for me. So 247 RSVPs as of midday today to this event means there is currently everyone in this room times 174. And that's just the ones we know of, and that's the ones the government counts. And many of them aren't sleeping rough. In fact, most of them are not. Many of them are couch surfing, staying in unsafe situations, or living out of their cars. It can happen to anyone. Anyone in this room, anyone of those 174 other. It can happen because of family breakdown, mental health struggles, or just not being able to afford a place to live. And when you're young, unstable housing means missing out on school, missing out on work, and missing out on the feeling of safety. That's why we need real solutions, not just crisis shelters, but long-term housing, mental health supports, and early intervention that actually works. We need services that listen to young people and policies that put our well-being first. Every young person deserves a place, a safe place to call home, and a real shot at their future. Let's break the cycle of homelessness.
Is Harry here? Alex? Alright, we'll have trim, we'll go to Matilda. We'll have we go. No? You don't hear from me again. Charlie again. Rin? Or Matthew? Does anyone want to come up? Give us a minute. Yeah, mate, we'll go with you and then we'll go to questions.
Bear with me, I've got literally nothing prepared. Hi, my name's Oliver. I'm a PhD student here at the ANU. And one big issue for myself and a lot of people in this room is affordability of rentals. A lot of people here will be either living on campus or will be living in share houses, which are increasingly harder to find. But for me, the one glaring issue, which I think a lot of people have on their minds, is how quickly the rent is increasing in Canberra, along with everywhere else in the world, everywhere else in Australia. One loophole that I've sort of seen firsthand is the fact that when a tenancy ends and a new one begins, there's no legal requirement for the landlord to keep the rent low. Each new tenancy can see an exponential growth in the amount of rent charged, which would not be the same if the same tenant was to stay in that property. My policy would be to limit the increase in rent for a property between tenancies, so when a new tenancy starts, to the same for when a tenant stays on with the property, which is 10%. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who submitted, even those who either didn't turn up or were just sitting tight, not wanting to come up. A couple of housing ones there. I might just come to you to kick this off. I guess both on affordability of actually buying a house and our tax system, if you could maybe give us some thoughts, but then also on that, I think that's a really great proposal. Here in the ACT we do have the sort of 10% increase, but is that a loophole that needs to be a bit closed up here?
Yeah, I have to say that first, I didn't get the name, I'm sorry, but the first speaker, I mean, more on the money than like 90% of people in federal parliament, so well done, I agree. Right now, we spend 5 times as much in Australia lining the pockets of private investors than we do on providing housing to people. And there simply isn't a way to fix Australia's housing crisis without flipping that around, or there is no reason to subsidise, private investors. This is actually quite a unique thing to Australia and New Zealand. We don't need to have a capital gains tax discount for housing investors. We don't need to have these negative gearing tax deductions. And bizarrely, we actually have a proposal from the federal opposition on the table that would basically expand negative gearing to non-investors, making mortgage repayments tax deductible for new buyers, which is only going to push up the cost of housing for everybody. So completely insane. Let's not do that. So yeah, I completely agree. We need to change that. And crucially, I don't want to harp on. I got the opportunity to say to speak when I was up at the lectern. We need to be putting that money into providing housing for people. When you look around the world at the countries that have turned their housing crisis around or avoided it altogether, they are countries where the government is a supplier of housing. They are not just leaving it to the private market like we do in Australia. We know what that looks like in Australia. We've done it before. We can do it again. The only difference between us now and us then is that we are a richer country than we've ever been. So we can absolutely do that. Going back to the pitch that we had about ending homelessness, I would say like a yes and yes, people are homeless for all these really complicated reasons, but the main reason people are homeless is because they can't afford a place to live. And I think one of the things that I've come across and been really disheartened by in my role at Anglicare is the way the housing crisis is kind of treated as this complicated, mysterious thing, like this black box. We don't understand it. It's basically a weather event that's completely external from government. They have no control over it. It's not true. We know why people are homeless, and it's true. You know, people might have complicated lives. They might be out of work. They might be experiencing mental health issues, but they will not be able to get those aspects of their lives back on track unless they have a place to live in. So it is the most important thing that you can do for people. And then the last thing I would say with renters is we have a system in Australia that is a hangover from when renting was a temporary thing that people only did for a little while back in their 20s. And many renters back then were renting from the government, which is a really different landscape to what we have now. So we have the same rental laws from that era, and they just haven't been updated to reflect the fact that many more people are renting and a lot more people are going to be renting for life. So in other parts of the world, it's actually about 2% limits above CPI for rent increases. And here in Canberra, we've got this CPI plus 10% limit on rent increases, and that's considered radical. No other state or territory government in the country is looking at it. And we have plenty of loopholes for things like new tenancies. So we need to change that. We have a model actually in Australia for that. This is the last thing I'll say. Commercial tenants in Australia actually have pre-agreed rent increases. They have leases that are 5 years long, and they are allowed to do even renovations to their properties. And you don't hear about these kinds of conflicts between tenants and landlords in commercial tenancies that you do in residential ones. So we have a model that we can look to.
Commercial share houses. Yeah. See where to go. Right, who's got questions? Chuck your hand up and we'll get a mic to you. And if you want to direct it to someone on the panel or just a general one, throw it out there. Please make sure it does have a question mark on the end.
Okay, this is for Phoebe and Jet also. Happy birthday, David. Just real quick. But Phoebe and Jet, obviously, like the national code, we're looking at gender-based violence, sorry. National code has been brought in. Universities need to comply with it by estimated probably March next year. Otherwise, their TEXO registration is at risk. In your opinion, do you think that the government needs to give universities funding in order to be able to combat gender-based violence on campuses when particularly smaller universities such as, say, UC, for example, or ACU have smaller student populations so they don't receive as much SAF as, say, compared to ANU, UNSW, UTS, who are able to drive so much SAF into being able to fund that. And then smaller universities have to scrape together leftover SAF that they've already allocated for the next 3 years to be able to come up with campaigns and a code for their own university so that they can then meet the national code so that their TEXA registration is not at risk.
Yes, absolutely. I think, legislation is not enough, right? Like there needs to be the funding, for universities to put these policies in place, and threatening deregistration is a useful tool, I would say, but it, as you've absolutely covered, is not going to be enough for a lot of universities to get where we need to be. So I absolutely think that the government should be stepping up financially as well as in terms of the legislation. Yeah. Would anybody else like to add to that? Yeah, and then thank you for raising that point as well. That's absolutely.
Hi, thank you. I just have a very simple question. Do you think it's possible to increase transparency in terms of financial stuff at ANU, especially in terms of salaries, and especially in terms of unpaid work that tutors are doing basically all the time? Thank you.
I'd love to chat a bit more afterwards if you do have time. I've obviously been very vocal about my concerns about the restructuring at the ANU and the way that it's happening. I think clearly there is a big hole in the budget. There needs to be change, but I think the way that you do that is incredibly important. And I've been very upfront directly with the VC and publicly about how that is happening. Yes, I've had similar concerns raised. The ANU is very unique in that it is an active parliament. It's the only university in the country that is, and she just directly can come to estimates, is answerable to Parliament. So I think there are avenues to dig into that stuff. But if you want to chat a little bit afterwards, we can get some details off you. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, Kia. I was just reading your pamphlet, and you were looking at to push for a full gambling advertising ban, which I found really interesting. I never heard of that, but I've always thought of it. What about things as well, like more limits on the advertisement of alcohol, considering, the drinking culture Australia has and the impact that has on so many other things?
It's a great question. The gambling ad ban there was a big inquiry in the Parliament, and unanimously, which doesn't happen very often in Parliament, everyone disagrees on a bunch of things. This inquiry, it's now called the Murphy Review, led by the late Peter Murphy, who was an amazing Labor MP actually. She really went these gambling companies. There's some great footage online. And they recommended 32 recommendations, and one of them was banning all gambling advertising over 3 years, giving sports time to find other sponsors. But really recognising that gambling is essentially grooming young people to gamble. And we know that there are now hundreds of thousands of under 18s gambling. And for a country that loses the most per capita in the world, we lose $32 billion a year on gambling, which is pretty insane for a country of 27 million people. We've got to deal with it. I think, on alcohol, same thing goes. We've raised concerns that the way these things happen is they're essentially industry sets their own codes, which I'd really disagree with. I think when there's harm from industries, the government should be far more proactive and active in actually setting the codes and saying this is when you can advertise, this is when you can't advertise. That's something I've been pushing, but I think this will continue to be a bit more of a conversation in the Parliament. Sophie Scomps, one of the other independents, has been doing stuff on junk food advertising. I think there's a range of products we all know that they know good for us. They're big industries, and they know how to make themselves attractive. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act between adults being able to do what they want, but really trying to protect young people and particularly children. Thanks, Gio.
Hello. Directed at wants to have a crack at it? Negative gearing. So if you were to come to an election, as I think this is more from a major party point of view, and I think we've seen this twice in the last decade. If you come to an election saying, I'm going to take away negative gearing, Australia's not going to put you in government. We've got a generation and a half with their, and I don't think this is a good thing, I would love to get rid of negative gearing. But the fact is you've got a generation and a half of Australians with their retirement tied into their property. And if you say, we're going to take away negative gearing from you, and a lot of people aren't necessarily enacting negative gearing on their property, but negative gearing does boost the property market, and that's where a lot of the value for it comes from, which again I don't think is good.
Yeah.
But the fact is, if you get rid of it, you scare the shit out of a generation of Australians, and they won't put you in government. And I saw earlier there was something about a plan as to how you would wind that back, and I think I'm just really curious what the proposal is, because you can't just come in tomorrow and say all the money that we're putting in negative gearing, we'll take that out, put that all in public housing. I think it would be great if we did, but it can't happen. It won't happen like that. So what is the realistic proposal for how you would shift that?
Great question, and I think you're right. I think in an ideal world you would kind of end it and say this is a really perverse incentive. I worked with Senator Jackie Lambie on looking at these options, and we got the Parliamentary Budget Office to, in real sort of detail, cost 5 different approaches. And the one that I think actually makes the most sense, given, as you said, the politics of it, is to just grandfather all the existing arrangements and say, you made these investments under the current rules, and we're going to honour that. And I guess the thinking behind that is that, on average, people keep an investment property for about 7 years. And so we're probably looking at, a 5-10 years to really, most of that will then be sold. They'll get those benefits, but then we'll have an altogether new system. And then to make it fair, as soon as you start talking about this, the Labor and the Libs go, well, supply, we need supply. And so you have a pared back 25% capital gains tax discount for new supply. So if you're buying off the plan as an investor, sure, you're adding to supply, you can get that. But if you're turning up to an existing suburb outbidding a first home buyer, you can't do that anymore and get a capital gains tax discount. And then just limit negative gearing to 1 property per investor. 70% of property investors only have one property. I think there are, in a bunch of countries, you can only negatively gear against the rental income, not your whole sort of personal income. I think there's other things you could look at, but what we looked at was just limiting it to 1. And that would save us $16 billion over the next 10 years. And I would come out the other side with a whole different approach to housing, and hopefully have a lot more people investing in shares rather than housing. Not everyone's going to like that. A lot of people probably won't, but I do think taking the politics into account, it seems sensible to me. And maybe on that any.
Yeah, I would really disagree with the premise of the question. Labor went to an election in 2016 with changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax on the table and won 14 seats. There are all sorts of reasons why what happened in 2019 happened, and if you look at polling over the past 2 years, it's been extremely consistent. A majority of people are open to changing these tax arrangements. Depending on the poll that you look at, Guardian Essential has done some polling, Galaxy has done some polling, and there's over the past 2 years, it's either a majority support or very close to majority support, a whole lot of people who are open to it, and about 15% who consistently oppose. That's actually not a lot, and it's a pretty remarkable result when you consider that there's been absolutely no national leadership on this issue for the past couple of years. Imagine how much more support we could have if we had a few more champions in Parliament like David who were actually taking this on. So I don't think that's quite right. I think what we do have in Australia is a political debate and discourse that is completely dominated by a very small number of people with a strong interest in the debate.
Like politicians who own investment properties?
Well, I would actually say the property sector and the landlords with many investments. So per capita, the think tank Per Capita has done some research on landlord sentiment, and what they find is that people who invest in one property actually have indistinguishable views on this from people who don't have any properties at all. It's people with the larger portfolios, 2, 3, 4, 5, who oppose this change actually, and they're the ones who dominate the debate. And so the challenge for this campaign, our campaign, Everybody's Home, but also just more broadly anyone who's campaigning to change this, is how do we make the people who want to live in housing and have that housing be affordable a more powerful political constituency than the investors, who are a much smaller number of people, because right now they're a smaller number of people but they have the power.
Hi. One of the things I've been most uniquely sort of disappointed by in the whole election campaign is like both major parties' policy on whether or not they want where they want house prices to go. Dutton's pretty upfront, he wants them to rise. Albo doesn't want to say that he wants them to rise. Claire O'Neill has said that she wants them to rise, and she's the housing minister. What is the outlook, the David Pocock outlook, on whether you want housing, where housing prices should be going, and like maybe sort of, yeah, I would say that's
a great question. I think that we all know the thing that's really killed the whole housing thing is that most of our parents, and it was even better for our grandparents, but housing was 3.5, 4.5 times your salary, and so you could afford to have a huge mortgage and actually own a home. Now you're looking at 8, 9, 10, 12 times, depending on where you're looking to buy. I quite like Alan Kohler's views on this. I think we should be looking to actually try and hold housing fairly steady for 15, 20 years whilst salaries catch up. If we truly do want housing to be affordable, and again, you've got to come back to the big question: what is housing for? Like, what's it for? It's so you have a place to live. We've currently got it set up as an investment vehicle, and that's why none of these people who just happen to own a bunch of investment properties say that they don't want that to happen. But I do think it's politically possible if we actually had the right policies and really went hard on supply. So it's kind of my view, probably not shared by many parliamentarians in there, unfortunately.
With everything happening in the UK and the US in regards to transgender rights and right now the lack thereof, how can you ensure that these rights in Australia are protected, respected and expanded, especially in regards to these people's physical and mental well-being, rather than following in this previous country's footsteps?
I'll maybe just give a quick hand over to you guys. Who wants to? I think to the Senate's credit, this has been something that's actually been reasonably well dealt with. There have been so many fairly out there crazy motions from a small number of people you can probably guess, really wanting to make this a big divisive thing. And we've seen most of the Senate, including a whole bunch of Liberal senators, actually take sort of a conscience vote on it and just shut down that debate, not support the kind of thing they're doing. The view, which I really support, is that this should be up to medical professionals to have this discussion as to what is appropriate, what age, set all those sorts of guidelines. And I think that the thing that most Australians probably don't understand, because we watch some of the news in the US and the UK, is that it's actually quite stringent here in Australia. It's not an easy thing to go through, and I guess that's been my line in the Senate. And I think I really hope we can avoid some of that divisive politics, because it really shouldn't be a sort of front and centre issue, I don't think.
I can add, completely echo everything you said, and I guess and once again, coming from this teenage boy lens and and youth mental health, I feel like all our algorithms are just, fueled with this divisive language, and there are a few small players in the game that are creating this divide. But at the end of the day, it's really not something that, if I think on transgender rights, it's not something we need to be worried about, what I should say is that we want to protect transgender rights, particularly, and it comes a point of I completely agree, let's leave it to the medical professions, but at the end of the day as well, I think we need to stop trying to comprehend everything and actually just show a bit more compassion to those populations, and they're one of us, and at the end of the day, if I speak on behalf of the Man Cave, all we're trying to do is just teach boys to be empathetic to one another. And I feel like if we can continue pushing that agenda of empathy for the people around us, they'll be happier lives.
Hi everyone. So my question is about Labor's policy to wipe 20% of existing HECS debts. So I pay my HECS debt up front, and so under their policy I would have spent more money than I needed to. So I just wanted to know, what do your proposed changes to HECS mean for people like me who have been paying as they go?
I think the 20% cut is attractive to a lot of people who've got a HECS debt, but as I said earlier, it doesn't actually address, there's no structural change there. You're just wiping 20% off, but you're not dealing with job-ready graduates, you're not dealing with the date of indexation, which is hundreds of millions of dollars of money that should be in people's pockets. So I would much rather they really have some structural reform to HECS than offer kind of these sweeteners. And I've been really concerned in this election campaign. At times it seemed like bribery to me. I'm not saying the HECS thing is that, but all these sorts of tax cuts and this and that, and it's what if this actually speaks to the kind of country we want to be? What is actually about values and some sort of vision for the future? It seems very much like, we'll give you this if you re-elect us, and then we'll try and figure some stuff out for the next election. But I don't know if Bruce is still online, but no, okay. I think there's a lot more that could be done than the 20%. And yes, it'll help a bunch of people, but it'll probably not be that fair on people who have tried to repay as much as they can earlier.
Hello. There's been a lot of really good discussion about rental and housing crisis for the future. But I want to shift the focus to right now. We're seeing a lot of youth and at-risk people, due to cost of living crisis, forcing themselves into rentals that are, unsafe, unsanitary, and just they're not up to human condition. Currently, as it stands, states and territories are responsible for their own rental laws and conditions and standards. Do you think we need to nationalise a body that gives cohesive, legitimate power over useless landlords that aren't doing anything, and that are going to enforce these standards and maintain safety for renters as it is now?
This is one of the big problems with federation, I think, where there are things that you just can't, are up to the states and territories. The thing that I've been pushing with the federal government, because they give a lot of money to states and territories when it comes to housing, is to actually attach some strings to that, and through that have harmonisation and sort of agreements across the board. And I think a national plan, given you need the buy-in of states and territories, could be a good way to do that. But May, this is your bread and butter.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think what we saw state and territory housing ministers come together with the National Housing Minister a few years ago to do this big agreement called a Better Deal for Renters, which had some extremely unambitious reforms in it and a lot of vibes, and it would be good to use a framework like that and strengthen a framework like that, maybe attach some money to it, to get action on things like limits on rent increases and minimum rental standards. One of the constraints on that, or one of the reasons I think the politics of that is hard, is because most landlords in Australia are these random amateur landlords, right? I think that's it's the root cause of a lot of the symptoms of the things that we're talking about. Housing in Australia is mostly delivered by random schmoes. Like it's extremely unusual. My water and utility companies and my electricity provider, they're not mom and pop operations. They're people, they're extremely well regulated. If I can't pay, they actually have to offer me a payment plan. It's extremely difficult to cut off someone's water or electricity in Australia because we regulate these like essential industries. But when it comes to housing, we've got this problem where we're very reliant on small-time investors because of the tax system that we have. So yeah, I agree completely with your question. We need some kind of framework to have minimum rental standards, but I think we also need to tackle the root cause, which is why do we provide housing this way in Australia? Why isn't government more involved? Why aren't more institutional investors more involved? Why aren't community organisations more involved? Why are so many of our landlords these people, these small-time people who can't deal with that kind of regulation?
We're going to go one more question. Sorry, Gio.
So I'll address this one to David. I know someone who's a victim of some very serious police misconduct by the AFP. After hearing about their story, not just with the police, but following up with legal aid, I went down a bit of a rabbit hole looking at police powers and accountability in Australia. I think we have a much worse situation in that area than a lot of other wealthy countries. And I suppose I'm asking, how did Australia get into this situation? Why isn't this a salient issue already? And do you think there's anything that can be done to prevent these kind of abuses?
Thank you. I guess on the question of how we got here, I don't know. I don't know the history of how police forces have and haven't been regulated across the country. Every now and then we obviously see issues in different police forces in different states and the NT. Here in the ACT, we obviously utilise the AFP, and that's really been my focus in trying to really push the top brass to improve the culture in there. I get a bunch of people come forward to me with concerns about the culture, the way things are working, and I've been pushing them really hard on that. I've met with the Attorney General about a range of different AFP issues. And so, I don't know, I don't think there's one single thing. Some of it is culture from the top. Another issue I think with the AFP is that they're the lowest paid police force in the country. And the AFP is dealing with a lot of national security stuff, child sexual abuse material, a whole bunch of things that I think are pretty hard to deal with, and I think they should be better resourced. I know that view is not shared by everyone. But that's really been my focus, but I'm really happy to chat later about some specific things, and if you think there's ways to push them harder. But I think there is an expectation that there is a bit more transparency and accountability when things don't meet the public's expectation. We time up or? One last question.
Sorry. Thank you. So in recent years, we've seen a real rise of extremism and political extremism, and to a certain degree also extremism within control of religious organisations. What kind of policies from a federal level, because this is an issue across the country, would you support to increase the supports for people who have been radicalised, for them to be de-radicalised and to prevent future radicalisations of people? Because like currently they're very unknown. I'm often involved in reporting people to police, which I feel like, I don't know about you, but I'm very hesitant to report a family member or a friend to police about a crime that they haven't committed yet, but could very well commit.
I mean, I think that's a really great question, and we've known for a while now that, you know, ASIO and our security people kind of say the biggest threat is homegrown terror. We know that. I don't think we've seen the same sort of focus on it. It's very easy to point over there and say, hey, look at that country up there. We need to really protect ourselves and spend hundreds of billions of dollars to do that, but we haven't seen the same sort of resourcing. I know there are some great programs that are actually looking, that are actually working with people, de-radicalising, early intervention stuff in communities that's sort of, you know, culturally appropriate and really well done. I think funding is probably the thing that needs to happen.
From, I guess, like a medical perspective, one thing that I think is kind of missing in that space is mental health care. There's a lot of people who, if there was mental health care that was a bit more proactive, they could access, they could understand, you know, that they're able to access and get help for these things, we can stop it. So it's not just in terms of like the crimes that they might commit in itself. There's often many other factors going into it, and if the mental health care system was a bit more proactive, easily accessible, and like, you know, Jed was mentioning in terms of young boys, or often, you know, we see in the media that they're often targeted by radical content, you know, the dark web, all those kinds of things, and having those kinds of mental health supports, community supports, I think is probably another way that we can stop, you know, the radicalisation of young people, especially when they're able to access all of this kind of material online, but often don't get mental health support alongside it, and so they just end up being missed and often progress with these ideals or those crimes that you mentioned.
Yeah, I'd also love to add that, like some of our research at the Man Cave that we do, one of the biggest barriers to teenage boys, particularly reaching out for support, is actually not the visibility of the services, it's actually boys describing how they're feeling. So it's less about, yeah, more psychologists or more people to help them in the room, but actually developing their internal work. And, you know, there was a massive funding pledge for like kind of, what's the word I'm looking for, like healing and recovery in terms of like the prevention lens. But I think if that was matched in the prevention, early intervention / prevention space, yeah, I feel like teenage boys' mental health particularly could be a lot benefited. And I feel like series of radicalisation is definitely going to assist there as well.
I mean, just to tie this off, I think one of the things that the Parliament is going to have to start grappling with us is social media companies' algorithms. You know, as a country, if you want to sell a medicine, you have to list what's on the thing. If you want to sell a food, you have to tell us the ingredients. If you're a social media company, do whatever the hell you want. No one has any visibility of what the algorithm is actually prioritising, how it's working out and what to serve people. And I think that is something that we need to start seeing the courage to take on these big, huge, you know, multinational companies who are sending people down some pretty dangerous rabbit holes. That's probably a whole other conversation. So we'll wrap it there. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you all coming out. If you do want to, obviously there's an election in, when is it? A week and a half? 10 days time. If you do want to join, speak to someone in a team Pocock shirt. Before the last election, I'd never been involved in politics like this. It's actually a lot of fun. You meet some great people. So sign up if you want. Otherwise, there is fried chicken and some alcohol beers on the way out. Please help yourself, and we'll be hanging around to chat. Please thank the panel again.